say in any capacity whatsoever is next week we will not have a Wednesday night class because a large portion of human beings are going to be at family camp, including me and the Reverend Sheck Snyder. So next week we will not have a Wednesday evening study meal. If you come here, the doors will most likely be locked. So don't do that. I said that at the beginning. I intend to say it as well at the end. Cohen, if you're locked in, if you're dialed in, are you dialed in? You're not dialed in. That's fine. Is there any? No, it's okay. No, it's all right. The moment's passed.
What do you need me to do?
All right. I want someone to remind me if by the end I don't say another Wednesday night reminder. Okay. To give me a reminder to do a second Wednesday night reminder, and hopefully the ridiculousness of this whole facade will result in a minimal number of people showing up for a non-existent event next week. Note that I say minimal because I know the number will never be zero. Regardless, this is our second week in our series on hermeneutics, a large word that means how we read something, in our case, how to read the Bible. Last week we set up broadly what the project was going to look like. We talked about some core convictions. Again, convictions I imagine were familiar to a great many of us. This time we are going to begin the process of diving in. We are going to start looking at a couple different genres. And today we're actually going to handle two different genres. They are, I think, deeply related. They are oftentimes present in the same books of Scripture. And so they do merit some consideration together. And those are narrative and law. So these are hermeneutics. First, we're going to talk about Old Testament narrative. Reverend Sheck Snyder is going to have a distinct class on the Gospels, which, is it Dr. Kara's? Kruger. Dr. Kruger's move to argue, and I'm interested in hearing it, I could imagine it's true, that the message of the Gospels is meaningfully different from the message of any other particular narrative, so that merits its own genre evaluation. That'll be good. But we're going to walk through the narratives of the Old Testament, just remembering what we're doing as we approach this is we're recognizing that the Scriptures are written primarily by their divine author. But the way that the divine author works is he works organically. He works through people writing in a particular place, people writing in a particular time. And he works through human language. And so the way that human language operates is going to establish how we read the Scriptures. When we understand the truth of the Scriptures, they should not be divorced from what they mean as plain human communication, right? That doesn't mean they're just plain human communication, but they are human communication in the fullest, truest sense of the word. So with that in mind, it's worth considering what do we mean when we speak of narrative? When we're talking about narrative, most often we're talking about a relaying of events, but not just of events generally. It's not a list of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, which I suppose could be a sort of narrative. But with a narration, what's being told is a story. And so as we're reading through Old Testament narrative, some tools that are helpful for us to read, I think, all stories, will also help us read Old Testament narrative and biblical narrative generally. I'd imagine this is true for Acts just as well. Everything that we say tonight will be pretty much just as true for Acts. So, stories are based around conflict and resolution. There's a conflict, and there has to be resolution to that conflict. And so when we look at a narrative, we are going to look for three critical things. We are going to look for setting, right? Background, needed information, something that's being told to you by the author with the intent of letting you understand what's going on here. Sometimes that's explicit at the beginning of a story. Sometimes you have to have read earlier in the story in order to understand the setting that's involved there, right? We meet with, why is his name out of my head? He's an Agagite. He's one of the main bad guys in Esther. His name is Haman. That took me a moment. So Haman is an Agagite. That means he is a child of an Amalekite. And so if you know what that is, if you have read about the Amalekites, about how they ought to have been destroyed, and they were not destroyed, and they committed themselves against the destruction of the people of Israel. The moment you read about Haman, you know this guy is invested in the destruction of the people of Israel, right? He's invested in destroying God's people. That's helpful. That's part of the setting. That's part of the background that's present there. So we have setting. We have the conflict of the story. And then we have the resolution of that conflict. Right? And oftentimes what happens is a conflict or a problem is presented to us relatively early on in the story, and the process of resolution itself takes a while. And then, of course, there are consequences that come about as a result of resolution. Something that's also relevant is that sometimes the resolution isn't total in the moment. Right? You think about the story with David and Bathsheba, right? There's a conflict that happens relatively early on. You could say that, in a sense, the conflict is David's sin, right? He's not going out into war. He's lusting. He's taking a woman who's not his wife. And then he's, as part of resolving that conflict, he goes as far as murder, right? And so resolution in that story looks first like what? What's the first level of resolution that we get in the David and Bathsheba story? The child's born. Well, not born quite yet. But after David has pulled off his plot, there's consequences, right? The prophet Nathan goes into David, and he uses a story to say, here is the problem, and David repents of his sin. That's a level of resolution, right? David has seen his sin. He has seen its wickedness. He's put up his hands. He is well and truly repented. That is a real good level of resolution. Are there further effects on the life of David and his family following? Yes. If you continue to read through that narrative, you'll see pretty much the rest of David's life, he is dealing with conflicts that arise in his family, largely because of this sort of problem, right, and this problem. So there's partial resolution, there's not complete resolution. I don't want us to get too hung up on that. So we're looking for those three things. We want to see what is the important setting that the story wants to convince us of and convey to us. What is the central conflict here? How is that conflict expressed? How does that resolution come about? And what are the consequences of that resolution? Okay. Those are just key. I'm going to give us a couple of tools. This is one tool. And then we're going to work through a text together and make use of these tools. So, looking for these elements of a story. In addition, we want to look at different types of exegesis. Right, ways that we read a story, and particularly now a biblical story, right? These three things are true of most stories. But when we get to Scripture, we're looking at, again, more than just a regular story. So, one thing that's common, right? When we look at a narrative, what's usually our first instinct? How do we first try to apply it to our lives? When we are told a story in the Scriptures, whether good or bad, what do we want to say? What is our gut knee-jerk reaction to it? We put ourselves in the story, right? Okay, good. And so then what does the story teach us? Teaches us, right, what we're supposed to do. I thought I heard someone say, right, whether something's right, whether something's wrong, right? You hear about Daniel in the lion's den, and what is your first response? That you ought to dare to be a Daniel, right? You see David and Goliath, and maybe, right, the first instinct of a lot of people is to put yourself into David's shoes. Now, is there legitimacy to looking at a story and trying to draw out moral example from it? Either something you ought to be doing when you're there or something that you ought not be doing. What do we think? I'm going to leave that open. Is that a legitimate form of reading a biblical story? I heard a yes. I heard a single silent yes. Did I hear any no's? Okay, good. I understand our hesitancy, but I think the answer is yes, right? What does, right, what Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. In 1 Corinthians, he tells his hearers, who certainly have their own problems, about all of the problems that happened in Israel's wanderings. And he says at the end of that, these examples were written down as warnings for us on whom the fulfillment, on whom the end of the ages have come. Right? These bad stories are written, among other things, and that's important, but among other things, so that you know what you ought not be doing, so that you should know how you don't behave in this particular situation. And so that is, we'll call that exemplary exegesis. Right? There are legitimate lessons to be drawn from this. And I think our hesitancy to affirm that those are legitimate lessons is our recognition that if you are only relying on exemplary exegesis, you're going to run into a lot of problems. Right? If the only tool in your toolbox is to look and to say, what ought I do, what ought I not do, then what problems arise? What are you left with? If all you see are moral examples or bad examples. Alexander. You don't see Jesus. That's a really good answer. I think that's an excellent answer. You don't see Jesus. Great. You don't see God's working it. I think that's helpful. Another thing that's helpful is that sometimes the stories aren't exactly super easy for you to walk into and say, is this exactly how we ought to behave, or is it not, right? I think of, again, we already referenced the book of Esther. There's a lot of, kind of questionable things about, is this the right way that God's people ought to behave throughout the entirety of the book of Esther, right? For one, the temple's been built, and they're all hanging around in Susa, right? They're hanging around in Persia. Is that maybe a problem? Maybe. I don't know. Possibly. There are limits to the powers of exemplary exegesis. We don't see Jesus, and all we really are left with is a go and do this or a go and don't do this. We're left with maybe a legalistic or a moralistic message, right? If we don't see the way that God, and specifically God through Christ, is going to be the one dealing with the conflict, we can be left with that level of legalism. And then when we're left with legalism and we're not able to live up to the demands of what the story tells us, then we can fall into despair, right? We may not act like David at his best, like Moses, like Abraham at his best, but might start to relate more to the bad people in those stories, see ourselves there. And that can bring you, again, to despair. So we need more than just exemplary exegesis. Do you have a further point, Mr. Alexander? There you go, yeah.
Try to sort of find the hero in the story. But if you're looking at Samson and Delilah, it's really hard to find a hero in that story. But if you
That's a good one.
God is the person in charge of providence, and that he's the hero of the story, as you kind of see in Adam and Eve when they fall, that you recognize that God is the hero.
Yeah.
Even if he's in the background like Esther.
Yep. That's good. I'm going to repeat what Alexander said because it's very much worth mentioning and repeating for those of us online. It's that if you only see yourself in the story, then you don't see God as the hero of the story, right? You don't see, like Samson and Delilah. You don't see God working through his judges that are pretty terrible people. In Esther, God is working the whole time, albeit not explicitly, right? He's pulling the levers behind the scenes. And Mordecai kind of makes reference to it once, but famously, right, God's name does not appear in the book of Esther. So good. So there are limits to exemplary exegesis, but they are helpful. And what is also helpful then is reading it. Alexander got to our third type, which is good to conclude with, but I'll bring us to our second type, a grammatical historical exegesis. A grammatical historical exegesis. This is maybe a very, I don't want to say plain reading of the text, but it's a very human reading of the text. This is the sort of understanding where I think we can most draw on things like understanding the ancient Near Eastern context to a story, understanding how the author is a particular person in a particular time, right? I think we talked about last week how the book of Kings is written kind of explaining to an exiled Israel how it is that they got to that point. Right? And the book of Genesis also, I think, is written to the nation of Israel as they're coming into the land, right? How they got to be where they are, how God made them to be a people. And so that particular time point in history is very relevant to understand. What is the intended purpose of the human author given their cultural, historical, and literary purpose? So I think it's relevant when you read grammatically historically, that you recognize that you are operating within a single book, right? Judges is a great example of this. If you read any story in the book of Judges, what you want to have in the back of your mind is Judges 1 and 2. And if you read Judges 1 and 2, it explicitly tells you how to read the entire book of Judges, right? It'll tell you the whole circle of God will deliver his people will be good for a while, they'll listen to his ways, then they'll forget his ways, then they'll be oppressed by a foreign nation, and then God will send someone to go and save them, and they'll be delivered, and then they will forget God, and they'll sin worse than their fathers, right? So Judges, right at the beginning, tells you, here's how this whole thing is going to play out. Here's the entire purpose behind the book that I'm writing to you. But while that's true explicitly of Judges, I think that's true of just about the whole book. But then also relevant to the grammatical historical method is to recognize that you are reading one book that is intended to be among other books. Right, even, again, on the sort of human perspective here. So let me pull up, or actually I can have someone here pull up. Would someone be willing to read 1 Kings 10, a decent chunk, 1 Kings 10, 23 through 39. 1 Kings 10, 23 through 39. Go ahead. Yes, I was asking for someone, and if you would be willing, that would be excellent. 23 through 39, 16 verses. Thank you. Okay, so Solomon has gotten his wisdom. He has done excellently. The Lord has prospered his hand. The Queen of Sheba just came and gave Solomon great tribute and was like, everything I heard was only half of the whole story. You're excellent. And so then we hear this passage following all of this splendor and this good work by Solomon, and we read this, and if we haven't read anything else in the scriptures, what does this look like to us? It looks like everything's going great, right? Everything is going perfectly. There are wonderful things here happening. There is great wealth and prosperity being brought into the land. But I saw people snickering, right? How is it relevant that this is part of a broader story? How have these truths already been communicated to us? What do we already know? Alexander. The king's not supposed to accumulate horses or gold or wives. Okay? Wives. Don't do it. I'm going to read from Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17, which Alexander's here referencing. When you come to that land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers shall set as a king over you. You must not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt to acquire many horses. Since the Lord said to you, you shall never return that way again, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Oh, Solomon's got a lot of silver and gold. Solomon also has a huge number of horses, and where is he bringing the horses from? Egypt, right? The place here in Deuteronomy, why would you not be bringing horses from Egypt? In Deuteronomy, it's probably relatively straightforward, right? Don't go back into the land. Don't go back to slavery. Don't go back to the land of sin, of death, of wickedness, and say, hey, you guys are doing really good things over here. Can we have some of the horses? And so when we read this as part of a broader story, as we recognize the connections of Scripture, we realize Solomon right here has already disobeyed Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17, right? He started looking at that wealth, and he started disregarding Egypt that comes with it, and is happy to bring along Egypt. And so perhaps we ought not be surprised when about a chapter later, what else does he start multiplying for himself? Wives and concubines. And does that have a bad effect on Solomon? And everyone nodded their heads yes, right? Not great, not great. But when we recognize, again, the grammatical historical connections that are being done here, we can see even beforehand, Solomon is not listening to the voice of the Lord, and here is how he's not doing it. Great. Now, we ought not leave ourselves there either. We have exemplary exegesis. We have grammatical historical exegesis, looking at the human author, looking at this book as part of one book. We also ought to consider that book is God's book. And so we ought to consider what we call redemptive historical exegesis. And all three of these reading strategies are going to be legitimate for us to use as we consider individual passages. All right, so with redemptive historical exegesis, we see how the passage we have before us is part of God's unfolding plan of salvation. Right, returning again to the book of Judges, what is the big weight of the book of Judges to teach us, right? It's that God's people need someone who's in charge of them. They need someone to lead them, to bring them in the ways of the Lord, that the Lord raises that person up, that the person ought to be a king, right? The recurring line of the last chapters of the book of Judges is, and there was no king in Israel. But also, what's the big problem with even the good judges in the book of Judges? Eventually they die. And what happens when they die? Everything falls apart again. There's a few years, the land has rest, and then the people of Israel turn away. So if we're looking redemptive historically, if we're looking forward, what else is the book of Judges teaching us? Not only that there must be a king, but that king must live forever, never die, right? And all three of these are part of how we read something. We'll look at moral exemplars, the meaning of the book as a human book, and the meaning of the book as part of God's book. Okay. Excellent. All three are, I would say, important. The last two especially are essential. Because what you can't do with just grammatical historical exegesis is recognize how what's in front of you has applied to you perhaps slightly differently than it may have applied to its original audience, right? And this becomes very relevant as we get to the law. Okay. Any questions at this point? Otherwise, I want us to jump in to a passage that we will work through together and try to apply these two sets of tools. Yes?
So these are three really good formats of exegesis.
Yeah.
But how do we keep from allowing our biases to influence those ways of reading Scripture?
That's a very good and not an easy at all question to answer. How do we keep our biases from informing how we get each of these differently? And I think what is perhaps best to do is to run back to the Word, right? That's a good baseline, right? Exemplary exegesis. You will draw all kinds of wrong examples if whether or not someone's a good example is based on how I feel they performed in this story or how the consequences even played out for them. Sometimes I would say consequences are kind of what the point of the story is, right? But also, you ought to be drawing back from the testimony of the word, right? Both for all three of these, for examples, for grammatical, historical, for redemptive, historical. Optimally, all three ought to be rooted in where you're seeing them elsewhere in Scripture. And I think this is also helpful, again, to work through your biases. We don't do this one person reading their Scriptures, right? Because that is a great way to run crazy with your bias, to kind of fall into subjectivism. You are part of a church, praise God. That church is part of a long-standing tradition that has been reading and distilling and better understanding for centuries, for millennia, really. And so I think both of those are helpful ways to limit bias. That's a great question. Does that get to what you were driving at, or did you have follow-up?
I'm sure it's a study to itself, but that's a good response.
Yeah, okay, good. It is that's 100%. If you guys want to dive deeper, I didn't explicitly reference it earlier because it's pretty intense. But is it Richard Pratt? He gave us stories. Is quite good on this. There's just the opening couple of chapters on that, especially. He really gets into the weeds if you want to spend your time on that. It's beneficial. Don't get me wrong, but the first few chapters are very helpful in terms of outlining how we ought to, as Christians, approach and limit our biases, and then also recognize that, like, sometimes you are going to come in biased and make sure they're the best biases possible, if you will, right? Yeah. That's a good read for that if you want to dive further.
I don't remember if it was Pratt or if it was
Okay.
that used the stained glass window analogy. It kind of gets to your question about looking through the window to understand like the background and historical, looking at the window itself and how the different pieces fit together. And then you're looking in front of the window in terms of like the context among other things going on around it.
Okay.
It's like three different ways to look at the verse
Yes.
to get at your biases, in a sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. So what were the three things? This was a new image to me. So reading the text of Scripture can be like looking at a stained glass window where you look.
Look at my notes.
Okay. Where you look through a window.
Behind the text, looking through the window to understand
Behind the
the
text.
historical, geographical, and archaeological background that occurred like earlier in the text. The text itself, looking at how the pieces of glass are put together, emphasizing the internal literary connections, the structure, and then in front of the text is looking at the window as a mirror, reflecting the reader's own circumstances and applications. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Yeah, that's good. You said that was maybe Kara, maybe Pratt.
It's in my notes as a lecture notes, so it might be Kara.
Okay,
But he might have been drawing it from the Pratt book.
that's distinctly possible. Kara's great. All right. We are going to read together a passage of Scripture. We're going to try to apply some of these. We are going to be looking at 2 Kings 5. If you have a copy of Scripture, you can go ahead and turn with me. For simplicity's sake, I will go ahead and read the portion we're concerned with. We'll be looking at 2 Kings 5, verses 1 through 19. Hopefully, just by working through things together, we can get used to some of these, maybe grow a little bit, hopefully come to a better understanding of this passage together. That's 2 Kings 5. I'll be looking at verses 1 through 19. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he was seeking a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hands over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored, like the flesh of a little child. He was clean. And then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, so accept now a present from your servant." But he said, "As the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive none." And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, "If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this manner." He said to him, "Go in peace." There's more to that story, but I think that is a decent encapsulation of what we're looking at here. So following through now these tools that we have, is there a setting established in the story? What do we see prior to the arrival of conflict? It's what? Tense political relationships. Good. Where do you see tense political relationships? Yes. Good. Okay, so the setting here is obviously a setting of tense political relationships. I think we see that in verses 1, and then Eve brought up really good verses 2 and verses 7. Right? What's being in the background here is that there has already been a war with Syria and Israel. And if you go back to 1 Kings, you'll see there's a conflict. They recognize that Israel has a powerful God, although they, in typical pagan fashion, don't quite understand it. But surely that's in part of the background here, that there is a tense political situation. Good. I think that's an important setting. Good. We'll write this down. What do we see in the setting? We see tense politics, past war. Clearly, there's not presently war, but there's slaves of one land living in the other. What else do we see in the setting prior to the arrival of our conflict? Maybe this is a good question. Where's the central conflict of the story? What's the big problem here? Leprosy. I think that's right there, right? Verse 1, this guy, he's got a problem. He is a leper. The rest of the story is dealing with Naaman's leprosy. It's dealing with that conflict being resolved, right? Everything else happens in light of that. The slave girl talks about it. He goes out because of it. His master sends a letter because of it. The king of Israel reacts because of it. Elisha reacts because of it. And just, the whole series of stories. Good. So we see that conflict is the leprosy. Good. We can talk more about that. We'll try to be quick here because I want to get to the law as well. What do we know about leprosy? It's contagious. So what do you do if you're a leper? Okay, you die, good. That is a big, that's very big. Don't miss that, right? Leprosy, you have it until the time when you die. You're shunned, right? You're outside. You are not part of the community anymore, right? That's the law of God, is that you ought not be part of the community because it's contagious and because you are going to die. And if you give it to anyone else, they will also die. So that's big. This guy has a serious problem, and this problem puts him out of the right people. It puts him out of his people, and by the word of the Lord, it puts him out of God's people. Now, was he one of God's people to begin with? No. That's part of the setting, right? Who is Naaman? Naaman gets pretty hyped up in verse 1. Commander of the army of the king of Syria, right? The big, powerful guys to the north, he's in charge of all of that army. He's a great man with his master. In other words, his king really likes him. He's a commander of the army. He's in high favor. By his hand, the Lord gives victory to Syria, right? He's a tool that God has used. He's also a mighty man of valor. So in addition to being impressive, loved by his king, a good commander, a commander that beats Israel, he's also himself a capable warrior, right? Naaman gets really hyped up. He's the highest he could be, except for this one really big problem that we see. He's a leper. And so I think that gives us a picture, right? So we have leprosy. We have tense politics. We have, I'll say part of the setting is we have a man of great social status is the leper, right? That's relevant. The text is really going out of its way to tell us Naaman's a big deal, at least in Syria, right? He is big and in charge. Okay. Now, the conflict is leprosy, and the resolution is pretty complete, right? He washes, he's no longer made a leper, and he responds. All right, being cleansed of leprosy. If leprosy is death, being cleansed of it is life. Life coming out of death. Maybe a big picture, maybe important, maybe relevant to see. Right? One who was highly exalted has been brought low, and then he's been brought back to a great place. His honor has been restored. He may resume his post. Perhaps he'll resume being a great man of war. Right? He's a capable guy. But he's been cleansed. Okay, good. This is maybe the central elements that we see. This is the main focus of the story, and now we can continue to work through it. And let's see. Maybe before we talk about, here, we'll try to do this for condensing sake. What's Naaman's first hope for resolution? Right, the conflict arises, and where does hope come from? A servant girl. How low do you get on the social ladder? Right? Who is this girl? First off, she's not just a girl, she's a little girl, right? This is not a young woman. This is a little girl. She is tiny. She is a slave. She is a foreigner. She's in a pretty low place. Does she speak as we might expect someone in that place to speak? I would say no. What does she do? She goes to her mistress and says, if my Lord were with the prophet in Samaria, he would be cured. Huge. Very small person, very small place, very strong statement. Exemplary exegesis. What do we think about this young girl? Good example? Probably across the board, yes. Think grammatically, historically as well. What's the purpose of the book of Kings? How does the book of Kings end? All of the people of God are exiled. They're out of the land. So do you maybe relate a little bit more to an exile if you yourself are an exile? I think so. right? You are, I think, being instructed, in a sense, to relate to this young girl, this young slave girl. Respond this way. Recognize that you too are in exile. All right, but that's not, I think, the main thrust of the passage. We see again and again these expectations, I think, of social status being overturned, right? When Naaman goes down, he goes down with just frankly an obscene quantity of silver and gold. He's hoping to buy his way out of the problem. Elisha doesn't even come forward. Elisha sends a messenger out, right? He doesn't go himself. Does that probably feel like a snub if you've built this whole caravan and are bringing down an obscene quantity of precious metal? Probably. And then he's told, go and wash in the Jordan. And is there anything special about the Jordan? No, not especially. Aren't the rivers of Syria better? How does the king of Israel respond? Does he respond as a king of Israel ought to? Not especially well. He can only look at this political lens. He says, I'm not God. There's nothing going on here. He doesn't have the faith of the young girl. But Naaman eventually is willing to humble himself. Right? The servant says to Naaman, this is no great thing. And if he asked you to do a great thing, you would do it. So go do the no great thing, right? This is a wonderful thing that's being told. The servant responds, calls him my father, right? There's a good relationship here. But he goes down and he dips himself 7 times in the Jordan, and how does he emerge? With the skin of a boy, like a little child, right? He comes out humbled and cleansed. And then what does he get? Naaman goes through the Jordan, goes underneath it, washes himself 7 times, comes out the other end humbled like a little child. And what does he ask for? He asks for what? Pardon. He does ask for pardon. That's big. We'll talk about that momentarily. The other thing asked for is 2 mule loads of earth. How is the earth important in this book and in other books? What is Naaman asking for? He's asking for land so that he can worship the Lord. Right? He's remaining Assyrian, but he wants the promise that's being given to God's people. Right? He wants part of the land of Israel so that he can build an altar to the Lord in his own land. And he's recognizing he's going to go back to his own land. He's going to have to, right, deal with pagan worshipers up there, so he's asking for pardon. I think he's saying, listen, I don't want to be worshiping Rimmon, but I have no option but to be there serving a man who does worship Rimmon. And Elisha's response is for him to go in peace. Right? And so Naaman is a Gentile, is a man who has fought against Israel, is a man who has humbled himself, who has crossed through the Jordan, and has now been given to the land of Israel. That's a pretty remarkable picture for us, isn't it? I think that's a huge picture when we consider, right, a people who are in exile are being told of the wonderful things that God can do to make even the Gentile unbelievers recipients of the land. And this is especially true, right, when we consider it redemptively historically. Right, God is promising that he is going to bring in people and to give them the fullness of the blessing that he's gotten. Okay. Rush through that a little bit at the end, but we do want to cover law in the next few minutes we have. Any pressing questions about that or anything we've talked about thus far before we try to, cram the entire conversation about the law into a few minutes? Don't worry. It's really straightforward and simple. Yes, Alexander? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's great. great connection, right? So Kings is dealing with the ministry of Elijah and Elisha, especially Elisha as a ministry of mercy, both to God's people and to people outside of them. Yeah, and that's very relevant. A couple of chapters before this, there's a king of Israel who leaves Israel to go to consult a pagan god to try to get healed. That's relevant. The chapter before this, Elisha feeds people. He purifies stew. The chapter after this, he makes an axe head float, right? There's provision even in all of this suffering and sin and wickedness that's provided, or that's surrounding. All right. Anything else? Great. Move on to the law. I was slightly being facetious when I said this would be no problem at all. As you guys know, this is not oftentimes the easiest passage of Scripture to read is the law. It's certainly one that sometimes we can be criticized by the broader world, and sometimes even by other believers, that we're not following consistently, right? People will always point to examples in the Levitical law anytime they want to make a gotcha and just say, really, what Christians are doing at the end of the day is they're finding the parts that they like, they're pulling it out, and they're forgetting the parts that they don't like. So, want to equip us with a couple of things to help us work through the law, help us better understand the law as it's presented, and remarkably, we'll find that there is overlap, I think, with the narrative. So there's a little triad that was given to me by Dr. Belcher that's helpful for understanding the law, and it's just a good set of 3 questions, which is, first off, why did God give this law? If you don't understand why God gave this law to Israel, to the church in the Old Testament at the time, then how well are you going to be able to apply it to yourself? We'd probably answer not super well. We need to understand that original meaning. We need to understand what it meant in that context in order for us to meaningfully engage with it now. One thing that we wanted to use as an example for this is looking at common threads to understand why a section is grouped together, because the law is not arranged arbitrarily. It's trying to make a point. And so to look at this, I wanted us to look at Deuteronomy 14 really quickly. There's a section there that talks about clean and unclean food. So I follow along if you'd like to. I'm going to go ahead and just read this section here. You are sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead. For you are a people, holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. You shall not eat any abomination. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. Every animal that parts the hoof and has the hoof cloven in two and chews the cud among the animals, you may eat. Yet of those that chew the cud or have the hoof cloven, you shall not eat these: the camel, the hare, and the rock badger, because they chew the cud but do not part the hoof, are unclean for you. And the pig, because it parts the hoof but does not chew the cud, is unclean for you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. Of all that are in the waters you may eat these: whatever has fins and scales you may eat. And whatever does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. It is unclean for you. You may eat all clean birds, but these are the ones that you shall not eat: the eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk of any kind, the little owl and the short-eared owl, the barn owl and the tawny owl, the carrion vulture and the cormorant, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hoopoe and the bat. And all winged insects are unclean for you. They shall not be eaten. Oh, clean winged things you may eat. You shall not eat anything that has died naturally. You may give it to the sojourner who is within your towns, that he may eat of it. You may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. All right, a lot of things here probably are relatively unclear to us on the first pass, right? Cleanness of animals is a difficult thing to talk about. Boiling a young goat in its mother's milk It comes up a couple of times in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch. But how does this section start? It doesn't start by talking about food. It starts by talking about death, right? Verse 1, you are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all of the peoples of the earth. And then, as the section concludes, death is brought up explicitly again. You shall not eat anything that has died naturally. You may give it to the sojourner who is within your towns, that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are people holy to the Lord your God. These twin ideas, you are a people holy to the Lord your God, and do not deal with death, are both starting and wrapping up this entire passage, right? And so this is a device that we see oftentimes in the scriptures. We call it inclusio, where there's a beginning and an ending that mirror each other. And the purpose is to sort of draw our minds again to this lesson, to this intention, to this central idea that we see here, which is, you are God's people. I have made you holy. The Lord has chosen you out of all of the peoples of the earth to be his treasured possession. Therefore, don't deal with death. Don't eat things that have died. Don't cut yourself or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead. And so with death in mind, we can start to see that pattern emerge as we work through the list of clean and unclean animals. Right? Do not eat the pig, which will eat anything, which will gladly eat the dead. Do not eat things that are in the sea but don't have fins or scales. Don't eat bottom feeders that work off of the ground there. Do not eat eagles, bearded vultures, black vultures. Don't eat all of these birds that eat carrion, nor do you eat the birds that will eat bottom feeders like the cormorant or the hoopoe. Don't eat winged insects, those that swarm around dead things. All of these things are telling us, stay far, far away from death because you are God's chosen people. And so then that can help us understand, why would you not boil a young goat in its mother's milk? Because that milk was supposed to be its life. By taking the young goat's life and then boiling it in life, you are making a mockery of the creature's death. And so that is one of the reasons that you ought not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. There's a through line that we see drawn throughout this passage that can help us understand. And so surely some of the distinctions are distinctions just because the nations around you do this. They are wicked, they are evil, they are perverse, they are drawing on wicked powers that you ought to have nothing to do with. But further, you are a people who are holy, you're called to be consecrated, you're called to stay far away from these things. Okay, so when we see there, we can see what's explicit, we see through lines, we can better understand why the law is given in the first place. We ought also to understand how is Christ the fulfillment? Poythress' book, The Shadow of Christ and the Law of Moses. Again, if you want to read a full book on this one point, it doesn't get better than that. It's an incredible read. It's kind of earth-shattering. He spends a good chunk of time talking about prison reform, but it's a really good conversation about prison reform because I think he does a really good job at drawing out the moral center that we see in a lot of the civil law that's given to Israel, and he helps us think about our own understanding of how we ought to understand justice, even justice in the civil sphere. So with that, how is Christ the fulfillment? You should generally be drawing on explicit references. You should see, how does Christ speak about this? How do the apostles speak about it? How does the book of Hebrews speak about it? And then once you understand what the original intention is, you're equipped to speak about how Christ is the fulfillment. And then thirdly, how does it relate to the church, today? And if you don't ask those first two questions, are you at all equipped to answer the third question? Absolutely not. If you don't understand its original intention, well, non-starter, right? We don't get even why this is here in the first place. If we don't understand how Christ is fulfillment, we don't understand how, if at all, frankly, things have changed. And so only then are we equipped to ask the question, how does this apply to the church today? Now, one we've divided the law, right, is between the civil, the ceremonial, and the moral distinction. That's an important distinction. It's worth repeating. So we'll talk about the civil law, those laws given to govern the body of Israel as a particular people in a particular time, the laws that you would give for relating to one another in, if you will, the human sphere of justice. You talk about the ceremonial law, the laws that are given for religious purposes, that one and all we would say prefigure Christ as the fulfillment. And then the moral law, the unchanging law of God for our lives, continues to persist. And so sometimes we get, I think we get the moral law decently well, right? We see how there is a moral core to just about everything, right? Very rarely is the distinction like it's only ceremonial, there's no moral component to this. That's purely civil, there's no moral component to this, right? There's things that you see borne out throughout. So Paul makes this point again, 1 Corinthians 9. He brings up not treading out the ox while it, or sorry, you know the one. Don't muzzle the ox while it treads out the corn, right? It's working. It is working for you, and so it deserves to feed rather than to be muzzled. You ought to let the laborer share in his wages. And Paul especially says, God's not talking about oxen, he's talking about the workmen, right? The moral core there is to apply this to human beings. Okay. Rush through this relatively quickly. Any questions at this point? I'd like to try to take a shot at applying this. Great. Let's go ahead. We'll turn to Leviticus chapter 15. We'll be looking at verses 19 through 31. Another passage that might be a little bit difficult for us to understand. Leviticus 15, we'll be looking at 19 through 31 specifically. I think the principles we draw out of 19 through 31 will be applicable at least for this entire chapter. All right. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything on which she sits, and when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. And if any man lies with her and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge, shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean as the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and bring them to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall use one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for her unclean discharge. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness, by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. This is the law for him who has a discharge, and for him who has a mission of semen, becoming unclean thereby. Also for her who is unwell with her menstrual impurity, that is, for anyone, male or female, who has a discharge, and for the man who lies with a woman who is unclean. All right. Difficult passage, hard to parse, a little bit uncomfortable. But we want to ask, why was this given to God's people? What is being presented here to us? And as an opener, right, what we see in this passage is that fundamentally, what's making someone, specifically a woman, unclean is not menstruation per se, right? It's linked to the time of bleeding, right? That's really more what's central here, right? Because it talks about regular bleeding, but then it also says if it's irregular, if it's constant, if it's not the healthy ordering of things, then it continues to persist. So what's more central here is the issue of blood. Is blood a big deal in the first 5 books of the Bible? Yes. What does blood signify? Life. Great. We got right to it. Life. Blood signifies life. This is explicit throughout the scriptures, right? And it's why the sacrifices we understand to be significant. Why they are able to make atonement is because they point to something's life being spilled out. God's explicit about this when he establishes justice in Genesis chapter 9, right? He says, man's blood is his life. If you shed the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. God says similarly there at the same time, you shall not eat that which has its life in it. That is, its blood. They're 2 terms, they mean the same thing. Blood is life. All right, so if the significance of blood is life, what does it mean if your blood is leaving? The blood is heading out of your body. The life is heading out of your body, right? You are in the process of dying. Your life is departing from you. And so now we understand why can't someone who's bleeding, go into the assembly of the Lord? Because they're dying, right? Death is an intruder. That is what we're being taught here in this passage. And that applies to you. If you are in death, if you are in the process of dying, that needs to be dealt with. Your death needs to be dealt with. Do we understand better why God gives this law in the first place? Hopefully so, right? He establishes it for us to understand our life is heading out from us. That needs to be dealt with in order for us to come before the assembly of the Lord. How is Christ the fulfillment of this passage? We could say a lot really quickly. But is there any passage in the New Testament that this really is looking forward to? Anything that we would say deals with this particular idea or pericope? Eve. Yes. There is a woman who has a discharge. She is impure. And that shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm just going to read Luke's version for us really quickly. There was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him, that's Jesus, and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" And when all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive the power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." All right. Camping out in this passage for a little bit, how do we see Christ fulfilling these old laws about our blood, about our death? Just look at details that are in this passage. What do we see that's true about the woman? What do we see that's true about Jesus? Let's start here. What's true about the woman? She was dying. Good. She had a discharge of blood. What else do we know about the woman? Alexander. Sorry? Jesus does sweat blood. That's a level I hadn't even thought about. That's good. Sweats blood praying. Yes. Yeah. Good, exactly. This woman has gone to, it looks like, every human institution. She's been going for 12 years. She spent every penny she's had trying to get this to stop. And when we understand the scale of the picture, we can understand why she would spend 12 years trying to deal with this problem, with the fact that the life is going out of her, and to no avail. Complete futility in the entire earthly sphere. There is nothing that is going to be able to do this. Right there, I think we're given taught a lesson, right, about the law that had been given Levitically. Good. So that's what's true of the woman. Absolutely nothing is able to heal her at all. She spent 12 years and all of her money. But when she comes to Jesus, what happens? She is healed, and not only is she healed immediately, right? She touches the hem of his garment. And I don't think that the teaching is to talk about clothes. It's to talk about the least possible contact you could have with the person, right? She is reaching out to the tiniest bit of Christ. Christ isn't even speaking to her. He isn't touching her. She's going to him. Now, surely Christ has enabled her to come forward in the first place. But as she comes forward, the tiniest bit of Christ heals, and it heals immediately. How is Christ the fulfillment of the fact that we're dying? He heals it. He heals it by his power. He heals it immediately. He heals it when we come forward by faith. How does that then apply to the church today? We recognize that God has done something about death. We recognize that God has done something about our death. And we recognize that what we see again described in the scriptures to us is that we have new life, right? That is now the reality that defines God's people in light of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. We've been given new life. And so now, what this teaches us is that things have changed because of Christ. We are able to come before him. We're able to dwell with God, right? The uncleanness is not a moral condemnation. That was something that maybe merited a little bit more conversation. The uncleanness is not a moral condemnation of the person. It's what healthy people do. But rather, it's a recognition that in our natural state, we are unable to come before God. But if we have new life, if that problem has been dealt with, then we can come before God. And so the purpose of this law is to teach us how Christ has enabled us to dwell with God. All right. Very quick run through of a little bit, an example of the law. 3 questions are helpful. They're basic, but they're true for each passage. And hopefully helps us understand the law just a little bit better. Any questions this evening? Cohen. Wow. What a great move, Cohen. Thank you so much. So Cohen has nicely reminded me that next Wednesday we will not be having a Wednesday night lesson. A number of us, including me and Pastor Schexnayder, are going to be up in the San, and Dan Smith is going to be gone too, and a few other people are going to be up in the mountains of California and will not be here. So do not come here next Wednesday unless you would like to knock on our locked door for a little bit. But that's all. Thank you for that.